So in this video, I'm going to give you a quick crash course on how to find and tell great stories. Maybe you are looking for stories to tell and post on social media, or maybe you're trying to make your sales pitches more interesting for your customers, or maybe you're just trying to contribute a bit more to conversations that you have with friends and colleagues. So in this very short video, I'm going to walk you through a 5-step process for finding and telling great stories. A quick introduction to myself. My name's Dixon. I'm a leadership coach, and my focus is on helping leaders unleash their influencing superpower, which is storytelling. I'm also the author of this book, The Story Habit, which you can find available on Amazon. Let's get straight into it. The very first step is to reflect on critical moments of change that you have been through in your life. Any story is always about change. It doesn't matter if it's a novel, if it's a movie, or even if it's an anecdote shared at a party. The key is the change that story is talking about. And actually, if you look at any big story, movies, novels, for example, you'll notice that there is one overarching change and lots of micro changes throughout. For example, any scene in a movie begins in one place and ends in another, and it's the change that happens in that scene that makes the story so interesting. And so if you are thinking that I'm just not a natural born storyteller, I don't have many stories to tell, well, you're wrong, because you're a human being. And if you're a human being, you've experienced change. You've experienced things like changing jobs. You've experienced things like starting new relationships with people or breaking up with loved ones and so on. So wherever you've been through a change, you've got a story to tell. So if I take a few typical examples, maybe you've moved to a different country, maybe you changed career, or maybe you've recovered from an injury. Any change like this is going to make for a great story to tell. But the really critical part is to find the really specific moments in those changes that will really bring it to life. For example, you moved to a different country, and one of those specific moments was the moment you set foot off the plane and saw the skyline for the very first time and felt the humidity for the very first time. When you were changing career, maybe a critical moment was the moment you opened the job offer letter and read that one word, congratulations, and knew that your life had changed. Or maybe when you were recovering from an injury, it was the moment you took your first steps after that injury and knew that you are now back to life as normal. So for this very first step, reflect on the changes that you have been through in your life and get really specific. Identify the specific moments that represent that change the best. The next step is then to relate that change to your audience. So here is another critical principle of storytelling. Any story is ultimately about the audience. The audience have to be able to relate to the story in order to engage in it, to understand it, and to immerse themselves within it. So think of the experiences, beliefs, and motivations that your audience have, and how can you relate your experience of change to your audience's experiences, beliefs, and motivations. Let's come back to the examples we were looking at earlier. You moved to a different country. Something the audience is probably going to relate to about that is the close relationship that you had with your parents and the sadness that you felt as you were leaving them and moving to the other side of the world. When it comes to changing career, something a lot of people will be able to relate to is the pressure of having to pay bills and look after your family, and having your spouse and your children depending on you, yet still not being able to provide for them. For recovering from an injury, something everyone can relate to is the physical freedom that you take for granted. You stand up, you sit down, you go out for walks. This is something most people do every day as if it's normal, and that was taken away from them in that experience. So this is step 2. Think about how you can relate that experience of change to your audience. Step 3 is then bring the challenge to life. So any story is always about change, and those changes create challenges for you. So how can you bring those challenges to life to really help the audience feel the pain that you went through and empathize with you? So for example, you moved to a different country. What was the challenge that you experienced? Maybe it was the homesickness that you felt as you really longed to give your parents a nice warm hug, but realized you were stranded in this foreign city and couldn't even afford the plane ticket back home. For changing careers, maybe it was the constant rejection. You went for 30 job interviews and finally got your first response letter, and it was a rejection letter. And you saw the disappointment on your spouse's face as you read it out to them. Or as you were recovering from an injury, the challenge was the frustration of putting your life on hold whilst you lay in a hospital bed, browsing through social media and seeing your friends continue life as normal, and reading all of the emails of work that was going on without you, and just feeling like your life was on pause. How frustrating that felt. So this is the 3rd step. Bring that challenge to life. Really help your audience feel the pain that that change caused you. But we don't want to end our story there. A story needs completion. So that brings me to the 4th step, which is where you want to show how you resolved that challenge. What were the steps that you took to overcome that challenge? What was the lesson that you took from this experience? So, coming back to our examples, you moved to a different country. How did you resolve the challenge? You learnt the language, and you gradually found things that you really liked about this new culture. You found restaurants that you loved going to with food that you'd never get in your home country. And you made local friends and talked about things that you'd never talk about with your friends back home. For the 2nd example, changing career, your best friend in your moment of need gave you some powerful words of advice that shook you out of your funk and gave you that spark to just keep going and remember that rejection is normal, and keep going until finally you got the job offer that you were looking for. And for number 3, recovering from an injury. Perhaps it was the moment you were lying in bed, feeling so frustrated, you reached out and you punched one of the rails on your hospital bed. And as you did so, you tweaked something in your injury and made it worse. And in that moment of pain, you realized the fight I am fighting here is not against my injury, it's against myself. So what were those critical moments where you learned an important lesson, or you found a way of overcoming that challenge? So that brings me to the 5th and final step, which is where you then want to go out and practice telling these stories, because the very first time you tell this story is never going to be the best time. You need to tell the story to other people and see their reactions. And when you see them looking really interested, nodding their heads, or looking confused, that tells you what's working about that story and what's not working about that story. And so then the next time you tell that story, you can tweak it based on the feedback that you got before and gradually refine your story. Think about comedians standing on stage, telling their stories and having their audience wrapped around their little finger. That is definitely not the first time they've told those stories. They've told those stories hundreds of times before and refined them over and over again to get them to that stage. So in summary, a 5-step process to help you quickly find and tell great stories. First, remember, a story is always about change. So reflect on the critical moments of change that you've been through in your life. And then remember, relate, challenge, resolve. This is actually the framework that I explain in my book, The Story Habit. Any story basically follows this framework of relating to the audience, presenting a challenge, and then showing how you resolve this challenge. And then finally, go out and practice it. Start telling it. Get feedback from your audience. and gradually refine it over time. I hope you found this video useful. If you're interested in learning more about storytelling, then check out my website, thestoryhabit.com. Or if you're interested in buying my online course to take your learning even further, then check out thestoryhabit.com/online course. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for your time and good luck.